which of course was a mistake.
So,
because it would go out again just as fast.
So, what happens? 5 years pass, we're doing other work, telephone rings, the Ministry of Agriculture is calling us up, the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Ecology is calling us up. They said, you know what, your plan's the best plan. Come back, we'll re-exhibit it, and...
there had been another election.
So, when you do political art, and when it's topical, and when there are very high stakes, you can be shot out of the saddle in a split second. But then, sometimes, a new horse comes by. Next.
Next.
Well, that's what it would have looked like with housing along the edges. Next. That's the stuff that would have been in it if they had done it our way. Next. Next.
These are just pictures to say that...
next.
That nature...
That's the installation at our New York gallery in Feldman. However, there were astonishing unintended consequences to this work. Not only is it a line on the map, not only did the Dutch do their ecology differently than we suggested, but they did it. Not only did they separate their cities differently than we suggested, but they did it. Next. But the EU funded a study of sustainable open space in Northwest Europe. Next. And the Green Heart was chosen, our line was chosen, and so you never can tell when catastrophe turns into opportunity.
And the other thing I should say that happened out of this was we got the only review we ever had on the page of the Amsterdam Financial Times, which said
yes,
that our proposal had been the best one that they heard.
Let's go back, you're right. Let's go back to the $200 billion economic engine that Helen and I were messing with. Well, we argued that if it was built in the center that way, the money would go out of the country. But if it was built slowly in the perimeter, as our landscape architecture student had worked out, why then $200 billion would flow back into the country in a great feedback loop. Generally, when you work at this scale, you have to suggest the economics of it, otherwise you're pie in the sky. That's our last sketch, and that's the one that the European Union used, I think. Pretty close. Next. So you could see that extraction, and go ahead again. You can see that extraction happens in many, many different ways. And it's always done, it almost always has a single purpose. It almost always, takes some form of energy, some form of material, some form of being, and changes it into something else for a short-term, lesser gain. And so the belief in the economy, the belief in the marketplace that we must always expand, those beliefs need to be challenged. They can't be challenged by pointing your finger or calling them names. You must outcreate them. When Helen and I are successful at all, it means that we've outcreated an existing situation and tossed something else on the table. Well, we get these telephone calls. We always get telephone calls. You would think email. But anyway, we get a telephone call from the head of an institution in where? In Munich. Yes, Weisswurststiftung. He wants us to write a book. We don't write books, we tell him. So he keeps bugging us about writing this book. Turns out that he's mad. And a whole bunch of other people are angry also. They're angry at the Hanover 2000 World's Fair. And why are you angry at the Hanover 2000 World's Fair? Well, it turns out that the World's Fair was supposed to be about the environment and about going green. And so the first thing they did was gave McDonald's the Green Food Pavilion. So 10 books were being written in counter-argument to this. Some of them were Nobels. And we were chosen because They wanted at least one artist who was familiar with the landscape.
And we had done a lot of work in the landscape. I mean, we've done many more.
Mostly watersheds, which we'll not show.
And he kept on, and finally he got us to agree, because we thought, how can we turn down being in a group with these Nobel Prize winners, etc.?
The argument we said was if we could figure out what Europe was to our satisfaction, we'd do it. Next. Well, here's what we did. It's what we call a field of play. It's a long story, but...
In other words, it was clear that water surrounded this, but where did the peninsula end? And many people think it ended at the Urals, and other people had other ideas, and we looked at it.
What we did was got a map, took out all irrelevant detail, that is, that was not geophysical, and we made a discovery. By privileging the mountains and privileging the rivers, we discovered that the Dnester River flowed into the Black Sea, the Vistula flowed off the Carpathians into the Baltics, the Dnester and the Vistula co-joined, almost co-joined. There's a right there in the Carpathians, and this whole peninsula, that as Helen said, surrounded by water, wetlands up top, was connected to the Great Russian Plain by only 30 kilometers. So we found our field. I claim that we're the first to find it. Helen claims that geologists knew better. So then we said, well, if that's our field of play, what's the salient feature? The salient feature were the mountains. So we lifted them off. And that's how Peninsula Europe, the high ground, began. Next. Well, the first thing we did, since we were commissioned, ironically, by the European Union, the German government, and 4 museums, and some others, I think, we made a 3-meter tall map of Europe with the peninsula of Europe as the center. It's an
azimuthal equidistant projection map.
We thought it was kind of cute for a couple of Americans, middle-aged to say the least, to toddle over from California and produce a German Eurocentric map, particularly since we were Jewish. So that was our icon. That's how we introduced the work. Next. Well, we decided to make an executive decision. The alpine definition of high ground is where the trees end. What we decided to do was redefine the high ground. As artists, we don't have to accept normal definitions. We decided to redefine the high grounds as where the rivers began. So we had map makers, and we began a research and found out that rivers in general began from the 300 to the 350 meter mark upward. And so we chose the shape that was 350 meters, next, as our icon. We lifted it off, and next. And then we did a series of maps wherein we discovered that Europe was so fractionated that each country had its own map, so nobody had ever put it together. So we put the watersheds together in the first watershed map of Europe, and then we put it in the public domain, and then we broke it apart to look at it.
It became really interesting, because if you look at that giant blue area, that's the Danube. That's how much the Danube affects Europe. And it's very interesting to look and see that as you get to the edges, the watersheds are very small, the mountain areas that go there.
Next. So we have this big show, and it's shown in a number of museums and stuff. We'll just show you the installation briefly.
Okay, next. We wrote the book, by the way.
Yeah, then we wrote the book. My goodness, it was very embarrassing.
And then they asked us.
Next.